In response to a question about James Comey's firing, Republican Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska said we are, quote, in the midst of a civilization-warping crisis of public trust. So where do we go from here? Senator Sasse is also the author of the new book, The Vanishing American Adult, and we are pleased to have Senator Sasse with us now. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
A lot to talk about with your book, but also a lot to talk about in Washington. So let's talk about that first.
Okay.
Whose job is it, you think, to fix that crisis in public trust that you speak of?
Eisenhower would say all of us. Eisenhower talked regularly about how all Americans should see themselves as having a part-time calling as a politician. We shouldn't have full-time politicians. People shouldn't move to Washington, D.C. and think that that's the center of the world. So people should serve for a term in office and go back home. But every American voter and citizen has a responsibility to pass on the meaning of the republic to the next generation. And so public trust should be all of us saying Washington can't fix everything. It should fix a small number of truly urgent national things. And we should do that with transparency and esprit de corps that says, hey, just because you and I might differ with each other on a policy, we shouldn't view that as the line between good and evil. Let's decide what we agree on as a civic narrative about our nation first, then let's haggle over policy.
I want to get your thoughts on specific things that are happening and set to happen this week. Deputy Attorney General, as you know, Rod Rosenstein, is set to brief the full Senate on Director Comey's firing on Thursday. What are the questions that you hope to get answered at that hearing?
So I'm the chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, so I've been in touch with the Deputy Attorney General since the first hours after this was happening, and he's now going to testify before all of us, and that's an oath-like ceremony. I want to understand more about the timing of his arrival in his job as DAG. The Deputy Attorney General tends to be the one to whom all law enforcement official agencies directly report, so it's an odd structure inside the Department of Justice, and the whys of that structure are really important. The Attorney General is a political appointee of the President. The Director of the FBI is typically a 10-year term. Why? Because we want to insulate those investigative functions further from politics. We've got an Article 1 branch, the legislature, Article 2, the executive, Article 3, the judiciary, but even inside the executive branch, we want to insulate the Bureau. And so the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, has this job of being over the FBI. I want to understand a little bit more about how we got to the place that he wrote this memo. What was he asked for it? How was he asked for it? Why was he asked for it? When was he asked for it? How does that relate to the White House's story about the President's decision to terminate Jim Comey?
Because your questions have to do not with the power and the ability of the President to fire the FBI director, but the timing and why now.
Right. I mean, reasonable people can differ about how the FBI executed its complicated job last year during the unprecedented complexities of the 2016 cycle. I think that Jim Comey is a very honorable public servant. He would never take a bribe till the end of time. He's a special public servant, and yet I think he made some mistakes during the 2016 cycle. Reasonable people can argue about those mistakes. However, to be fired in the midst of an investigation of the President's campaign associates and his organization, that doesn't do anything to restore public trust. It exacerbates the erosion of trust, and we should all be concerned about that, regardless of who you supported in the presidential election.
As you know, Senator, the President tweeted on Friday, James Comey better hope there are no tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. That was the exact tweet by the President. Are you satisfied that there has been enough clarity regarding whether or not conversations in the Oval Office have been recorded or are being recorded?
No, I don't know how anybody could be satisfied about that tweet. I mean, I think it makes all Americans kind of ache, because one of two things are ultimately true. Either there are tapes and recordings of conversations in the Oval Office, or there aren't, and we pretended there were, and both of those are kind of crazy. Like, I mean, it's not okay to be taping things against law and against federal records, federal presidential records preservation acts. On the other hand, if there were no tapes, why are we seemingly tweeting threats? I think the whole thing is really uncomfortable for everybody, and I think the President has a duty to explain to the American people what the heck that tweet meant.
Right, because White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer has been asked a number of times about that tweet and about whether or not there are recordings of conversations in the Oval Office, and he has just said that the President, there's nothing further to add. He's got nothing further to add, that the President's tweet speaks for itself. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that everybody in public life has a responsibility to say, hey, in our republic, the 320 million Americans, they rule. The power is with the people. The government has a limited set of enumerated powers, but they come from the people, and the people delegate those responsibilities to their representatives for a short time, but ultimately the authority remains with the people. The people need to understand what the heck stuff like that means, and I think that everybody in public life has a duty to try to explain themselves and their actions to the public.
Meantime, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the president trying to go forward with a legislative agenda. We know healthcare has been at top of mind for the president. Also, tax reform has been something Republicans have talked about. What do you think all of this is doing to the president's legislative agenda?
Well, the president's only been in office for, 120 days, and this whole 100-day concept is kind of silly. FDR created the 100-day agenda as a way to empower himself in 1932-33 to try to force an urgency during an obviously urgent time during the Great Depression, but it's not really helpful to think in terms of 100 days. But when you do look at the beginning of an administration, I think we can unbundle a lot of the president's actions and praise him on some things. Other things we could ask lots of hard questions. But Neil Gorsuch, great nominee to the court that the president picked, a guy who believes that the job of the judiciary is to ultimately apply the Constitution to particular circumstances, not to try to be a super legislator. So I praise the president for picks like Neil Gorsuch. In other domains, it's hard to have clarity about a legislative agenda when there are lots and lots of distractions. Washington is not an urgent place. That's one of the things the American people were signaling last November. They wanted Washington to be more urgent about big things. Those should be things like, in my view, replacing Obamacare with a kind of health care plan that helps people, helps American families have an insurance policy that goes with them across job and geographic change. We should be getting that kind of work done, and right now DC's kind of wrapped around the axle.
Well, in an interview with NBC last week, the president said if Russia hacked or had anything to do with interfering in the 2016 election, he wanted to get to the bottom of it. Every intelligence agency, even some members of the president's own cabinet, have agreed that Russia did interfere with the election, yet the president remains skeptical. How does that affect public trust in our institutions? Well,
that's a big problem, right? Because right now when we talk about Russia, everybody looks back at it as the 2016 cycle, and it's sort of a shirts and skins exercise. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Did you vote for this candidate or that candidate? And we hear the Russia investigation through the lenses of last year's election. I'm concerned about that, but I'm frankly far more concerned about 2018 and 2020, because what Russia does next is going to be a lot more sophisticated than what they did the last time. They want to sow seeds of distrust and doubt among us. They're trying to exacerbate this crisis of public trust. And frankly, the technology of cyber warfare is accelerating really rapidly. And what the Russians are going to do next is leak lots of information, credit card records, phone records on public officials, and they might be 97 or 98 or 99% true, and then they'll seed it with 1 or 2 or 3% fabrication so that you did travel to City X on this date and City Y on that date, but really, did you make all these illicit purchases at such and such establishment in a city at a certain time? And that kind of stuff should concern all of us without regard to our partisanship, and I wish the president would take more of a long-term view about the kinds of challenges we're actually going to face from Russia going forward.
Should there be an independent investigation?
I haven't called for one at this stage because I think we need to restore trust in our institutions, and if you do that today, I'm open to that conversation going forward, but if you do that today, what you really do is you offer a no confidence vote in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I think there's still real possibility that that institution can make a difference. Richard Burr, the Republican from North Carolina, Mark Warner, the Democrat from Virginia, they actually trust each other and they work well together on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I want that investigation to go forth. If that thing ultimately falls apart, I'd be very open to that next conversation, but right now what I'd like to do is have the people believe that some of our extant institutions can work.
And if the president remains skeptical and continues to publicly express skepticism about Russian interference with our election, what is the message being sent to Russia for future elections?
Yeah, I don't understand what the president's goals are with regard to Russia. Here's the fact. We know that Russia did interfere in our election. We know that Russia did try to build relationships with all sorts of people. We don't know how far that went inside the Trump organization or the Trump campaign or particular names that have been mentioned. If the president has concern for the public trust and the civic agreement and the harmony of American Union 5 and 10 years in the future, he should be thinking about that and leading us forward on those kinds of topics today. It's hard to understand really how he prioritizes at the present time.
All right, Senator Ben Sasse, thank you so much. I know you're staying with us here. We are going to take a quick break right now, but when we come back, we're going to talk to the senator about his new book and what he calls our unprecedented coming of age crisis. Stay with us.